Michael Bloomberg is a great big piece of shit, and I'm going to tell you why. Bloomberg is the fetishism of the pragmatic center made manifest. Every so often, Bloomberg considers a run for president with the idea being that he's not a Democrat, he's not a Republican, sometimes not an independent, but a technocratic get-the-job-done type who eschews labels. That is a very charitable way of saying he switches party affiliations and goes whichever way the wind is blowing. In 2015, concerned that Hillary Clinton's primary fight was pushing her too far to the left to compete with Senator Bernie Sanders, Bloomberg's Wall Street friends pushed him to run. He was even encouraged by Fox head honcho Rupert Murdoch. The political pundits' constant advice for Democrats over the years has been to move to the center, but the center never stays still. It moves with the times, and as the Republicans move further and further right, the center is now right of center. Pundits claim that the problem with both parties is that they have moved too far into their ideological extremes. But in truth, the Republicans moved to the right, and the Democrats, in hopes of keeping up, moved to the right as well. Enter Michael Bloomberg. In a race that already has a centrist as the frontrunner, Bloomberg is here to be even more centrist, somehow. The most centrist of all centrists. But he's not really. He's pretty right-wing, and a lot of Democrats know this. As he announced his candidacy, a Morning Consult poll indicated that he is the most disliked candidate among the Democrats. Nearly 25% of likely primary voters view him unfavorably, the highest disapproval rating of all the remaining hopefuls in his party. Bloomberg, like all billionaires, is concerned about the Medicare plans proposed by Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Such plans would almost certainly raise his taxes, being among the super rich, and with a net worth of a mere $55 billion, this will not stand. What if he loses half his worth? Then he'll only have $27.5 billion. That's only enough money to end homelessness in the United States of America and still have $7.5 billion left over. Michael Bloomberg is sticking up for the millionaires and billionaires, poor subjugated men like Howard Schultz who thinks that being derided for his wealth hoarding is tantamount to a slur. He prefers to be called a person of means, and he can just fuck right off, right? Why Michael Bloomberg is running for president is debatable. Maybe he's trying to save his fortune. Maybe it's a vanity project. Maybe it's a way to shake up the election to draw attention away from Sanders and Warren, leading to him eventually endorsing a relative centrist like Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg. Maybe he's actually hoping to lose the primaries, run as an independent in the general election, and siphon off votes from whoever ends up being the actual Democratic candidate. That way it'll keep Donald Trump in office and his taxes low. I don't know. But what I do know is that Michael Bloomberg is just terrible. Let's start with the obvious reason why. Michael Bloomberg's tenure as mayor of New York City is defined by how he oversaw policing in the city, most infamously stop and frisk. Stop and frisk is a strategy that allows police officers to do exactly what it says on the tin, to detain someone for questioning on the street, in public housing projects, or in private buildings where landlords request police patrols. Prior to this directive, the police still had incredible power. They can arrest us, fingerprint us, take our DNA, they're allowed to retain our personal information in their computer databases, monitor our movements through cameras placed around the city, trace our records and car registration, obtain our phone records, and they all carry lethal weapons that they have consistently been proven to use at the slightest provocation. They can doctor statements and plant evidence and almost always get away with it. Across the roads leading from the so-called good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods, police are stationed and are the primary enforcers of redlining. They use these powers to control the poor, reinforce predominantly white property, and to intimidate minority communities. Individually, one might believe they are here to protect us, but as a system, they exist to protect property under capitalism. But you know what? That's a rather broad topic, so let's focus on how Michael Bloomberg gave the police one more weapon in their already gigantic arsenal. The Stop and Frisk directive states that officers are required to have a reasonable belief that the person is, has been, or is about to be involved in a crime. However, that determination is made entirely by the police officer in question. A rule that states a police officer needs to think the person on the street is a bad guy before intimidating and searching them may as well not exist if there is no actual recourse for the person on the street. A rule that limits police officers means nothing if the police officer can always override it. If police officers believe that the detainee is armed, an officer can conduct a frisk by passing his hands over the person's outer garments. Once again, this determination about whether or not the person on the street is armed is made by the police officer, which means that this limitation only exists in theory but not in practice. Furthermore, while the suggested manner in which to frisk is hands over the person's outer garments, it would be naive to think that the police always followed that particular suggestion, instead digging through their pockets. Police have incredible reach to intimidate the population for virtually any reason. Under stop and frisk, the NYPD targeted Black and Latino males as young as 13 simply for living in neighborhoods with high crime rates or for making furtive movements. This is a loosely defined term that encapsulates roughly any type of behavior, including but not limited to looking over a shoulder or sitting on a bench. That is not an exaggeration. That actually came up in court. During Michael Bloomberg's tenure as mayor of New York City, police officers stopped and questioned people under the pretense of suspicious activity more than 5 million times. So, how did this get started? Well, the truth is that stop and frisk policies existed for law enforcement for decades prior, but Bloomberg oversaw and consistently endorsed a massive expansion of the policy. This did not simply happen under his administration. He publicly supported it. After taking office in 2002, the number of stops multiplied by 7. The vast majority of those searched were young Black and Latino men. According to the New York Times, in 2009, Black and Latino people in New York were 9 times as likely to be stopped by the police compared to white residents. The policy resulted in a series of lawsuits by Black and Latino men. One man, Nicholas Pert, was held at gunpoint on his 18th birthday as an officer passed his hand over the young man's groin and buttocks before leaving without any explanation. This was not an isolated incident, as it was one of the 5 times he had been stopped by police under this policy. These searches were for weapons that almost never materialized. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, only 14 out of every 10,000 stops conducted during the Michael Bloomberg era turned up a gun. In other words, the stops were no better at producing gun seizures than chance. Police were as likely to find a gun on whoever they believed were suspicious as they would if they chose someone's name out of a hat. According to the ACLU, Black and Latino people were more likely to be stopped and frisked, even though their white counterparts were twice as likely to be found with a gun. Bloomberg falsely correlated a fluctuation in crime stats with the expansion of stop and frisk, but in reality, crime rates are affected by more than just police tactics. If stop and frisk actually had directly lowered the crime rate, then curtailing it would have increased the crime rate. However, when stop and frisk was curtailed in New York City, the crime rate still dropped. In other words, stop and frisk did not directly lower the crime rate. Other factors did. Stop and frisk was a waste of police manpower and did nothing but further erode the relationship between the police and the citizens of New York. So, how did it end? In 2013, a federal judge ruled that policing under Michael Bloomberg amounted to policies of racial profiling of Black and Latino people. Unfortunately, Bloomberg appealed this decision. It took another mayor to end stop and frisk in New York. During Bill de Blasio's first term as mayor, stops decreased by 76%. At the same time, crime fell to levels not seen in the city since the 1950s. It continued to fall. The only way to end stop and frisk was for there to be no more Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Following his tenure as mayor, Bloomberg continued to defend stop and frisk every time it was brought up. In fact, he defended it as recently as this year. As he prepared to run for president, he finally apologized and acknowledged he was wrong. The timing of this is transparent. Even though he apologized, he also pivoted and avoided the topic, stating that nobody ever asked him about stop and frisk before he decided to run for president. This is such an obvious and demonstrable lie. We all have Google. You have talked about this endlessly for years. You know who asked you about stop and frisk? The courts, when it asked you to end stop and frisk, and you appealed the decision so the police could continue to harass Black people, you mummified old bastard. This turnaround on stop and frisk after years of court battles to protect it and declarations of innocence is completely disingenuous, and only a fool would believe that Bloomberg's heart suddenly grew 3 sizes on the day he happened to announce his presidential campaign. But stop and frisk was not the only heavy-handed police directive under Bloomberg. Yeah, I know, but wait, there's more. Michael Bloomberg's NYPD spied on mosques, Muslim communities, and Muslim-owned businesses and restaurants. A surveillance project was undertaken despite no evidence of terrorism or criminal behavior. This contradicts claims by Bloomberg where he denied that the NYPD launches investigations based solely on religion. He said, "We don't stop to think about the religion, we stop to think about the threats, and focus our efforts there." The police commissioner made a similar denial, but a report by the Associated Press clearly indicates that Muslims were under heavy surveillance in the city due solely to being Muslim, and not for any criminal activity. A secret dossier published by the Associated Press shows the NYPD both thinking about religion and singling out a particular group in the absence of any leads whatsoever. This wasn't some rogue entity either. It was part of the NYPD's demographics unit, a group of officers tasked with mapping where Muslim Americans lived. According to the Daily Beast, plainclothes officers who investigated Muslims were called rakers, named after the figurative coals they raked Muslims over. Those who investigated specific places rather than specific people were called mosque-crawlers and would monitor sermons. In addition to profiling Muslim Americans and all the bigotry that comes with that, the demographics unit was also a big waste of time and money. In all the time it existed, the demographics unit never produced one lead. Not one. Bloomberg also cracked down on Occupy Wall Street protesters. Anything that upsets the status quo, and anything that upsets billionaires, is the enemy of Michael Bloomberg. During a speech at MIT, Bloomberg stated, "I have my own army in the NYPD." That's who he is. A man who sees the police as an oppressive force that he utilizes to control the population. So, we have a general idea about where Michael Bloomberg's politics land in terms of domestic policy, but what about foreign policy? Bloomberg not only supported the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq, but he also supported a bizarre and false justification for the war. The conspiracy theory that Saddam Hussein was responsible for the 9/11 attacks, and not Osama bin Laden. Some version of this common lie was told by Vice President Dick Cheney and the talking heads on Fox News. In 2007, Bloomberg backed the Bush administration against congressional Democrats who were trying to find a timetable for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq. But that's not all. Bloomberg is a long-standing supporter of Benjamin Netanyahu, the disgraced Israeli prime minister indicted for fraud. When Israel assaulted Gaza in 2009 and 2014, Bloomberg flew to Israel to support the civilian bombings. In an interview recently, he once again indicated his support for bombing hospitals, while using right-wing talking points about Hamas hiding in hospitals to justify the catastrophic loss of life. Bloomberg helped launder the reputation of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in March of 2018 when he hosted the future murderer of Jamal Khashoggi in New York and smiled for photos with him in a Starbucks. Now you might think, hey, that's not fair, that visit happened before the murder and dismemberment of the journalist. Okay, but has his support changed since then? Not one bit. In fact, in September of this year, long after the murder, Bloomberg sat down for an interview with the Saudi-owned newspaper Arab News, where he lavishly praised the economic reforms made by Mohammed bin Salman and said that he is going in the right direction. No mention of Khashoggi's murder, Saudi Arabia's war crimes in Yemen, the imprisoned women's rights activists, torture, beheadings of gay people, or anything like that. Just money talk. Let's get away from the Middle East for a minute. What else does Michael Bloomberg believe? Let's go to the lightning round. Alright, there is so much more. In the first years of his tenure as mayor, Bloomberg jumped up 100 spots on Forbes' billionaires list, the single largest increase by any individual in the world. Meanwhile, the same mayor who touted his CEO-style managerial abilities began to erode the government's relationships with the city workforce. His bitter battles with the NYC unions eventually caused a New York Transit Authority strike. He once unfavorably compared the United Federation of Teachers to the NRA. Democrat Bill de Blasio lamented that when Bloomberg finally left office, he had failed to resolve labor contracts with 152 of the city's unions. In 2004, Bloomberg advocated for the re-election of George W. Bush. He was also firmly in favor of the Patriot Act, which allows greater state surveillance. Oh yeah, and Michael Bloomberg's policies directly contributed to the explosion of the homeless problem in New York. In 2013, city data showed that there were more than 52,000 homeless people residing each night in the municipal shelter system, up 69% since Bloomberg took office. This is the largest number of homeless people in New York City since the city began keeping records more than 3 decades ago. This record-high shelter population includes more than 22,000 homeless children, and the number of homeless families increased by 80% since Bloomberg took office. What did Bloomberg say about this? Well, he evaded and used some half-truths. He claimed that New York City has a lower rate of street homelessness than many other major U.S. cities, but that doesn't mean it has a lower rate of homelessness altogether. The reason street homelessness specifically is lower in New York City is because New York City has the legal right to shelter, unlike any other major city in the U.S. This is not because of Bloomberg, of course. It's thanks to legal victories won by the Coalition for the Homeless and the Legal Aid Society. The statistics showing the increase of homelessness under Bloomberg is undeniable. It's just that there are so many in shelters that he's saying, hey, at least they're not bothering you on the sidewalk. So, how did this happen? Bloomberg took away permanent housing resources from homeless families, which drove the shelter census to an all-time high. Bloomberg cut off homeless families from priority access to public housing apartments and Section 8 vouchers. Permanent housing resources that had successfully helped move tens of thousands of homeless children and families from shelters to stable housing under 3 previous mayoral administrations. He replaced those programs only with short-term subsidies that the Coalition for the Homeless called a revolving door back to homelessness for thousands of families. When asked about a homeless child that made the news in New York, Bloomberg offered only this: "That's just the way God works. Sometimes some of us are lucky, and some of us are not." Yikes. So, how about Bloomberg and women's issues? Bloomberg has long been accused of making offensive and belittling remarks about women's appearances and sexuality. According to the Business Insider, he has faced scrutiny over remarks attributed to him in a booklet with quotes presumably made by himself called Portable Bloomberg: The Wit and Wisdom of Michael Bloomberg. It features a number of misogynistic, racist, and homophobic jokes. One quote attributed to Bloomberg read, "If women wanted to be appreciated for their brains, they'd go to the library instead of to the Bloomingdale's." He avoided confirming whether or not he actually said that, and berated journalists who questioned him about it. Now you might think, oh, big deal, he's just kinda gross. Well, it's actually more than that. Last year, Bloomberg questioned the hashtag #MeToo movement, telling the New York Times that the battle against sexual assault had gone too far. He also defended Charlie Rose shortly after he was fired for sexual harassment. There is more. There is so much more, including Bloomberg's history of not believing women when they come forward about being assaulted. But let's wrap up. Michael Bloomberg is so overtly vile that he seems like a caricature of a billionaire that you see in movies and TV. Instead of taxing the rich, he has recently advocated changes that will effectively tax the poor. That's how much of a billionaire caricature he is. He oppresses minorities, has a far too cozy relationship with the police, treats women like objects, actively harms the poor, and has no firm ideology except maintaining his own power and wealth. Bloomberg's policies are so out of line with Democrats, even some centrist Democrats, that he has opted not to join the debates. He's doing this by not taking donations since he knows full well that donations are part of the debate qualifications. This gives him an out. It's clever enough, but still transparent. Michael Bloomberg probably won't win the Democratic nomination. He's polling 5th, and centrists already have their milquetoast candidate. but his presence could disrupt the primaries, or even the general election in other ways mentioned earlier. The best way to take away his power to do that is to see through his bullshit.
That's a very big problem for this country, and you don't solve the problem, as the populists would argue, by taking things away from the rich. You solve the problem by giving opportunity to everybody and by creating jobs. And some of these things, I think, some of the policies are misguided. I, for example, am not in favor, have never been in favor of raising the minimum wage. I think